His wife called him a pathetic poor mechanic behind his back and cheated on him with his own boss. He didn't argue, didn't make a scene. He just stayed quiet and started planning how to make them both regret it for the rest of their lives. Do you believe a quiet man can flip the whole game? Stick around to see how he did it. Mark is 35, short, jet black hair, streaked with oil near the temples. His hands are rough, fingers always stained with grease, no matter how hard he scrubs with scalding water and the strongest soap in the garage. He's not much of a talker, not big on showing emotion. But anyone who ever brought their car to that old shop where he worked remembers one thing. The engine always ran smoother when it came back. Mark is the kind of guy who'd show up if he needed help at 3 a.m. He once fixed a widow's car for free. She lived 2 blocks over. Every winter, he personally topped off the coolant in the old sedan owned by the elderly man next door, the one who once said, "My son hasn't come home in 3 years." He lived simply. At the garage by 6 a.m. sharp, home by evening for whatever Tina had cooked, then stretched out on the couch with an old auto repair manual. Mark didn't dream big. His idea of success was owning a small garage, just spacious enough to work without bumping elbows, just quiet enough to play jazz while turning a wrench. And he loved Tina. Tina was his total opposite. Bright eyes, pin-straight glossy hair, always smelling like expensive perfume. She worked in the marketing department of a big e-commerce firm. Most nights she came home complaining, mean coworkers, impossible boss. But she also loved parties, bars with dim yellow lights and cocktails in every color. On their wedding day, her mother didn't bother hiding her annoyance. She once asked, "What are you thinking, marrying a mechanic?" Tina had laughed and said, "At least he'll always know how to fix things when they break." They were truly in love. Mark always picked her up. Rain or late hours didn't matter. She once told him, "You're not rich, but you feel like home." And Mark believed that with all his heart. But things didn't stay still. She started complaining that he never changed, never wore a suit when they went out to dinner, never talked much at her friends' parties, didn't understand finance, investing, or anything she called real adult life. "Why don't you open your own garage? You're 10 times better than your current boss," she asked. "Need money and customers. Besides, it's not the right time," Mark replied. Tina sighed. "With you, it's never the right time." That's when the distance started. Tina began coming home later, stopped cooking much. Her eyes stayed glued to her phone, watching travel vlogs, clips about productivity, successful women, and couples with picture-perfect lives straight out of a magazine. Mark kept doing what he always did, fixing cars, cleaning the house, tweaking the plumbing. Every day, the same routine. But what he didn't notice was that Tina had started pulling away. No arguments, no shouting, just silence. And every night, the space between them in bed quietly grew wider. Then came their 5th wedding anniversary. Mark got home early. He brought a small bouquet, baby's breath, the kind Tina once said she loved because it's soft and doesn't try too hard. He planned to cook her favorite spaghetti, even figured out how to play soft music on the Bluetooth speaker, something he'd never touched before. Tina wasn't home. She was at an upscale spa downtown, the kind of place successful women go to unwind after work. Mark knew the address. She'd mentioned it once in passing. He went, unannounced, hoping to surprise her, flowers in hand, just to say, "Happy anniversary." But he froze the moment he got near the spa's waiting lounge. Tina didn't see him. She was sitting with her legs crossed, smirking at her best friend under the soft, ambient lighting. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "I used to think he'd change, but he's still just a poor mechanic." The words weren't sharp like a knife. They didn't cut skin, but they crushed something in Mark's chest. He didn't get angry. He didn't walk over. Didn't make a scene like some cheap movie. He turned around, still holding the bouquet. When he got home, he tossed it into the trash bin behind the house. One flower fell out, flattened by a bike tire that morning. That night, Mark sat alone in the garage. No lights on. Just the dim yellow glow from the corner street lamp reflecting off the metal wall. He stared at their wedding photo tucked in the drawer, the frame chipped at one corner, the glass covered in dust. In the picture, Tina was beaming. Mark looked stiff in a rented suit. For the first time in his life, Mark felt like he was someone's burden. And for the first time, he started thinking about leaving it all behind. Not to disappear, but to make sure no one would ever look at him like that again. He didn't say a word to Tina that night, didn't ask why she said what she said. But something changed, quietly. He started coming home later than usual. Not because of extra work, he just didn't want to come home early anymore. Not to a cold dinner and the eyes of a wife who once called him a burden. A week later, while changing the oil on a Mercedes S-Class at the garage, a younger coworker tapped Mark on the shoulder and said quietly, "Thought you knew already." Mark looked up, wiping his hands on a crumpled rag. "Knew what?" The guy glanced around, then shrugged like what he was about to say shouldn't be said, but it was too late to take it back. "Your wife's sleeping with the boss." Mark didn't move, didn't react, but his hand clenched the wrench so tight his knuckles turned white. Nobody said anything else. There was no need. In a place like that, with the smell of motor oil, the clang of metal, and no one giving a damn about personal drama, rumors like that didn't come from nowhere. Mark didn't ask for details, didn't ask Tina, didn't lose his temper, didn't confront the boss. He just waited for his shift to end and went home like any other day. Only this time, his eyes didn't look straight ahead. They stayed down, watching his feet. When Mark got home, Tina was sitting on the couch, hair still wet from a shower. She was laughing with someone on the phone, her voice softer, sweeter than it had been with Mark in weeks. He didn't walk in. He turned toward the bedroom and opened the closet. He didn't need to ask, didn't need proof. But he still checked the laundry basket in the bathroom. In the corner, there was a gray towel, one he didn't recognize. It wasn't theirs. He checked Tina's old phone in the drawer, no password. A few messages hadn't been deleted. At the end of the thread, "He left 30 minutes ago. I told him it's over, but he's still hung up on the garage. Don't worry, babe, he's too slow to notice." The messages were from a contact labeled, "Blake, boss." Mark closed the phone and set it back in the drawer. Silence. The house had never made the hum of the AC sound so loud. He walked out into the living room. Tina looked up. No panic, no attempt to hide anything. She just stared at him for a moment, then turned off her phone screen and exhaled, like it was finally time to say what had been waiting. "Aren't you going to ask?" Mark didn't answer. She stood, arms crossed. "You heard, didn't you?" Mark looked at her. No nod, no shake of the head, but his eyes said everything. Tina sighed. No tears. No apology. "You're not the kind of man I'm proud to introduce to people. I'm tired of living like I have to carry the weight for both of us." Mark stayed silent. She went on, "I need more than a guy who changes oil and says everything will be okay." Not a sound. The words weren't a punch, but they hit like stone. They didn't break Mark. They hollowed him out from the inside. He turned away, opened the closet, pulled out an old suitcase, folded some clothes, just a few t-shirts, a couple of faded jeans, his toothbrush, and the bottle of shampoo he kept at the garage. He didn't take anything else, except for their wedding photo in the cracked frame, the one that broke during an argument about the electric bill 2 years ago, and a 20-inch wrench passed down from his grandfather, the one he used to fix his first car when he was just starting out. Tina didn't move as he walked to the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, not raising her voice. Mark stopped, turned back, really looked at her, head to toe for the first time in a long while. "I don't know, but not here." And then he walked out. The door closed behind him without a sound, but to Mark it was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. That night, he didn't call a friend, didn't book a hotel. He parked behind the garage where he'd worked for 8 years. He lay in the car, seat reclined all the way back, head resting on a rolled-up jacket. It was cold outside, the windows fogged with his breath. He didn't turn on the heat, just closed his eyes. No blaming, no anger. No calls to anyone. His hand stayed wrapped around the wrench. His eyes stared up at the ceiling of the car, thick, pitch black. Nothing echoed in Mark's mind. No, why did she do this? No, do I deserve this? Just silence. Long, cold, deep. And this time, no one inside was waiting to open the door and let him back in. Mark's first night sleeping in the car didn't turn out to be his last. It stretched into a pattern, 2 weeks, then 3, until it became routine. He started staying at the garage all day, picking up night shifts from anyone who wanted to head home early. The manager didn't ask questions, just seemed surprised that Mark was suddenly always there. He wasn't the guy who clocked out on time anymore, ate lunch at noon, and took scheduled breaks. He became the guy who never left. Mark worked non-stop, day and night. The oil stains on his hands had sunk so deep they couldn't be scrubbed off anymore. But he didn't care. He needed money. And something else. A direction. During short breaks, while others smoked or scrolled through games on their phones, Mark sat in the storage room beside the rack of old parts. He opened his beat-up laptop, plugged in headphones, and focused on videos about running a garage, how to price services, how to manage staff, how to build customer loyalty. He started ordering secondhand books on eBay, spines cracked, pages yellowed, but still packed with value. Small Business Blueprint, From Grease to Growth, Garage Owner's Handbook. Mark started taking detailed notes in a notebook, one he used to reserve just for jotting down license plates and minor car issues. He didn't share anything with anyone. No complaints, no mention of Tina. To his coworkers, he was just the quiet guy who worked twice as hard, stayed the latest, and talked the least. Meanwhile, Tina was now openly with Blake, Mark's former boss. They showed up together at a few automotive startup networking events. Some coworkers whispered that Mark had been replaced way too fast. She still lived in the old house, the one where Mark had fixed every squeaky hinge, repainted the fence by hand, and installed the porch lights himself. But that place wasn't the same anymore. Now, every weekend brought wine parties, loud laughter, and luxury cars filling the driveway. The rumors about Tina and Blake eventually reached Mark. But he didn't react. Not a single comment. Just one quiet shift. He stopped looking at anything that no longer belonged to him. One day, while inspecting the engine of a 1969 Mustang, an older man walked up, well-dressed, calm voice, respectful tone. "You the one who worked on that Pontiac GTO last week?" Mark nodded. The man nodded back and extended his hand. "I'm Roger. A few of us collect vintage cars. Heard you've got a steady hand." That moment sparked a string of small but special jobs. Not the usual broken axles or faulty brakes, but maintenance and restoration of classic cars. A 1964 Chevrolet Impala, a 1970 Dodge Charger, a Plymouth Barracuda. These weren't just repairs, they were trust. And they marked the beginning of something different. They didn't need quick tire changes. They needed someone who understood cars like living things, who could hear the engine and sense its rhythm like a heartbeat. Mark didn't show off, but these clients, wealthy collectors, didn't care for flash. They cared about precision, and Mark had it in spades. He spotted the niche, a small, tight-knit circle of clients willing to pay top dollar for trust. They valued detail, consistency, and had zero tolerance for mistakes. After a few months, Mark started keeping records on all of them. Notes on preferences, requests, car models, maintenance schedules. He wasn't just fixing cars anymore, he was becoming their personal technical advisor. And from that, the idea of his own garage came back to life. This time, no longer a vague dream. This time, a plan. Mark reached out to an old friend, Lucas, a guy from high school who now worked as a freelance accountant. "I need a small loan," Mark said, straight to the point. Lucas paused for a moment, then said, "I figured you'd call around a time like this." A few days later, Mark held a signed lease for an old warehouse tucked into a quiet neighborhood on the north side of the city. It wasn't flashy, no big storefront, but it had a high ceiling, good lighting, and decent soundproofing. He started fixing it up almost entirely on his own, repainting walls, replacing outlets, installing ventilation, setting up a small front desk with a beat-up coffee machine. The sign out front was simple. Mark's Classic Auto Care, precision over speed. No grand opening, no ribbon cutting. But on the first day, two of his old clients rolled up. "Roger said this is the only place worth trusting," one of them said. Mark didn't smile. But for the first time in months, standing in the middle of his own garage, he didn't feel empty anymore. Day 17, since opening the garage, Mark was still making the coffee himself, wiping down the counters and checking every tool by hand each morning. The sky was overcast, light drizzle in the air, the pavement slick and cold. He was crouched beneath a 1957 Bel Air, inspecting the brake system, when he heard it. A soft engine hum, but not just any hum. It had a tone, an age, a presence. A 1961 Lincoln Continental rolled slowly into the lot, original silver gray paint, worn leather seats, a wood-trimmed ashtray, and old license plates that were aged but spotless. Behind the wheel was an elderly man, mid-70s at least. Silver hair, cropped clothes, thick wool coat, polished brown leather shoes that caught the faint light just right. The old man stepped out of the car and stood still for a moment, scanning the garage with a sharp, assessing look, like he was sizing up an operating room, not a repair shop. "You the owner?" His voice was low, measured, not harsh, but carried weight. Mark nodded. "Yeah, I'm Mark." The man didn't respond right away. He circled the car slowly, then pointed underneath. "It makes a clicking noise when I turn left. I don't want a long explanation. I just want to know if you can fix it." Mark crouched down, listening carefully, then asked just 3 questions. How long does the sound last? At what speed does it happen? When was the last time the suspension was replaced? Then he gestured toward the waiting room and got to work. An hour and a half later, Mark returned with a hand-drawn diagram, simple, precise. It showed a slightly loosened crossbrace under the chassis and a section of aged rubber seal. No fluff, no upsell, just facts. He handed over the sketch and said, "I'll replace this, reinforce it with steel bolts. Should take about an hour. That work for you?" The old man studied the drawing, then looked at Mark. For the first time his eyes softened. "You know how to hear a car breathe," he said slowly. Not many can do that. Mark wasn't sure why that line made him stand a little straighter, but something in the tone, quiet, unembellished respect, felt like he'd just passed a test. After that first visit, the old man came back with a Thunderbird. The next week, it was a Cadillac Coupe de Ville. Each time, he didn't say much, but he watched everything closely. Slowly, he started staying longer, finishing the coffee Mark made. Once, he brought an old newspaper and sat reading it like this was a shop he'd been visiting for years. 2 months later, while Mark was checking the electrical system on a Buick, the old man returned, this time without a car, but with a folder in hand. "I have a proposal," he said, placing the envelope on the counter. Inside was a full investment plan. Expansion into 2 new garage locations, both in high-income neighborhoods. Site surveys already done. Financials, projected costs, expected ROI. Clean, precise, no fluff. "I'm not putting money into this out of pity," the old man said. "I'm doing it because you're better than half the guys running big shops I've seen." Mark stared at the documents, stunned. "Why me?" The man looked at him for a moment, then shrugged. "Because I'm tired of watching useless people show off. I need someone who shuts up and gets the job done. Like you." It wasn't until a few days later that Mark learned who the old man really was. Harold Blake, father of Blake, Mark's old boss, the man who stole his wife. The truth came out from a regular customer, someone who saw Harold leaving the garage and chuckled. If his son ever finds out about this, he'll lose his damn mind. Mark didn't flinch, his heart didn't race, but something shifted inside him, cracked, quietly. Not from hatred, but from the irony. The man who once called him trash with no ambition had now been replaced by a calm, fair-minded old man. And that man happened to be the father of the one who had kicked Mark down. Mark never told Harold about Tina, never mentioned the past at the old garage. He didn't need to, and maybe Harold didn't need to hear it. A few weeks later, the contracts were signed. Construction began on 2 new locations, one by the river, one near the Palm Heights Estate District. Harold didn't interfere with the work. He stayed exactly as he said he would, a quiet investor. And that was all Mark needed. Mark still worked on cars every day, still wiped down engines by hand, still checked every detail himself. But for the first time in a long time, he let himself think further. About a system, a brand, and a place in the world no one could ever look down on again. In his small office hung a new wooden sign, carved with the words, "You don't have to speak loud. Just get it right." Mark didn't care whether Blake ever found out. He didn't need Tina to look back. The people who once thought he couldn't no longer lived anywhere near the horizon he was aiming for. Not long after Mark's 2 new garage branches officially opened, a feature appeared on the front cover of a local business magazine. The headline was simple, but it caught attention. From unknown mechanic to classic garage owner, the quiet rise of Mark D. The article wasn't filled with praise or fluff. It told the story plainly. His night shifts, his late-night study sessions with secondhand books, his sharp move into a niche market, and how he built a brand not on loud ads but on quiet trust. Alongside the piece was a photo, Mark standing in front of his garage, holding a grease-stained rag. Behind him, a line of restored classic cars, polished to perfection. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't posing, but that calm, steady presence made more than a few people stop longer at the newsstand. Tina saw the article too. She was sitting in a hair salon when she saw it, flipping through the magazine while waiting for her color to set. Her hand froze for a moment when her eyes landed on the familiar name. That night, Mark got a text from an old number he thought he'd deleted long ago. "Can we talk?" No explanation. No extra words, just that one line. Mark stared at the screen for a few seconds, then typed back. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., the old cafe, corner of 5th. The next morning he arrived early, took the corner seat by the window, ordered his usual black coffee. Sunlight angled through the glass, casting long streaks across the scarred wooden table. Tina arrived a little later. Still put together, still elegant, her hair straight and resting neatly at her shoulders. But her steps lacked the certainty they once had. She sat across from him, cappuccino in hand, but didn't take a sip. Mark looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with nostalgia, just like someone seeing a person they used to know well, but who no longer belonged in their world. "I saw the article," Tina said, her voice quieter than usual. "You did it." Mark nodded. "I did what needed to be done." She pressed her lips together and glanced down at the worn tabletop. "I'm not here to apologize," she said plainly, "and I'm not here to come back." Mark stayed still. "I just wanted to say one thing." She looked up. "I did love you, but you had no ambition. I saw you stuck in the same place forever. I thought, if I stayed, I'd get pulled down too." Mark nodded again, no bitterness in his face, no sting in his eyes. "I get it. Back then, I couldn't see past hard work and skill. I thought living well was enough for people to recognize your worth. But sometimes, being kind isn't enough." Tina said nothing. Mark set his coffee down. His hand still carried the old habit, gently rotating the cup's rim, the way he did when thinking in the garage. "Do you remember the first car I ever fixed?" he asked. Tina nodded, a little caught off guard. "The old green Mustang?" "Yeah. Wouldn't start, fuel was off, frame was rusted, but I didn't want to junk it, because I saw something in it that was still worth saving. Same way I saw myself back then. All I wanted was a chance not to be looked down on." Silence settled for a few seconds. Tina's eyes welled up. She didn't collapse, didn't sob. Just one quiet tear slid down her cheek, swift, silent, like a feeling that had finally slipped past its armor. It wasn't regret. It wasn't about wanting to go back. It was the cold truth hitting her all at once. Sometimes you leave people when they're still small, but when they grow, you no longer have a place in their life. She wiped the tear with a tissue and sat up straight again. "You really have changed," she said, eyes red, voice steady. "No," Mark replied, "I'm still the same. The only difference is, I don't need anyone's approval anymore." She nodded, then stood, gave him one last look. "I hope you find happiness." Mark didn't answer. He looked out the window, where sunlight was catching the roof of a vintage Camaro parked across the street. And just for a moment, Tina, and everything old, messy, and painful, seemed to dissolve into that sunlight, light as if it had never weighed so heavy. Tina walked away without looking back. The cafe door closed softly behind her, like the quiet end of a chapter that didn't need a dramatic punctuation mark. Mark stayed for a few more minutes, finished the last sip of cold coffee, then stood up. There was a car waiting at the garage, a new client scheduled for 1 p.m., and another day, already in motion. That conversation closed the past, more gently than he expected. But life doesn't leave space empty for long. Change always comes, and this time it didn't knock. It slammed straight into the sign hanging outside his shop. 2 weeks later, the name Blake started popping up in the news. Not in the business section, but under financial investigations. An independent media outlet published a report analyzing suspicious cash flow between several old garage branches under Blake's name. Signs pointed to tax evasion, money laundering, and embezzlement from investor funds. At first, it felt like just another rumor. Then came leaked documents. Then came calls from the IRS. Former employees were summoned. Several locations were locked down. Mark wasn't surprised. He'd seen how Blake operated, flashy, all talk, more about controlling people than building systems. But he hadn't expected it all to unravel this fast. One morning, a message lit up Mark's phone. It was from Lucas, the same friend who'd helped him get his first loan. "Your old name's about to hit the 6 o'clock news." Mark watched every frame of the segment. Blake appeared in a brief clip, face pale, swarmed by reporters firing questions. Behind him, a preliminary indictment board listed charges: money laundering, falsified records, and dozens of shell company garages. But what caught Mark's attention wasn't Blake. It was the name listed under persons of interest: Tina Davis. Not as the mastermind, but as someone whose name was tied to multiple accounts. Someone who'd processed internal transfers while working in Blake's office. Part negligence, part blind trust. 3 days later, Mark got a call from a law office. They wanted him to testify. As someone who had worked under Blake for several years, someone who might understand the internal manipulation. Mark didn't say no, but he didn't say yes either. He asked for time to think. That night, while Mark was going over the import parts list for his new location, someone stood outside the garage door. It was Tina. She didn't speak right away, just stood there, thinner, visibly worn out. For the first time, Mark saw her without makeup. Her eyes were sunken, her hands gripped the strap of her bag like it was the only thing holding her together. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said, barely above a whisper. "I just wanted you to know, it didn't turn out the way I thought it would." Mark nodded. "Life usually doesn't. I thought you'd be happy to see us fall." He looked at her. "I don't have time to be happy about other people's misery." The words were calm, but they hit hard. She didn't reply. Mark didn't ask where she was staying, didn't bring up the lawyers. He knew she'd find her own way, somehow. A few days later, he called the law office back and declined to testify. "I'm no longer connected to that person," Mark said simply. "I just want to keep doing my work." The voice on the other end hesitated, surprised maybe, but didn't push. It wasn't about protecting anyone. It was that Mark no longer needed to show up to prove anything. The people who once looked down on him were now facing the consequences of their own choices. He didn't need to lift a finger. A week later, Mark drove out to a quiet beach on the edge of the city, a spot few people knew. He sat on the hood of a vintage car, watching the waves roll in. The ocean breeze was salty but soft. He didn't feel triumphant, but he didn't feel bitter anymore either. Some battles don't need to be won, only walked away from, at the right time, so others can fall on their own. The waves kept rolling in, steady and quiet. Mark sat there for a long while until the sky faded into purple. Not to dwell on the past, not to plan the future, just to sit still for once after a long road, to breathe and move forward without dragging along what he'd once tried so hard to bury. A few weeks later, an independent auto magazine scheduled an interview with him. This time, it wasn't about technical expertise or the vintage car market. It was about him, the man behind the rising name, Mark's Classic Auto Care. The interview took place at the main garage, the place where it all started. The reporter was a young woman, quick voice, sharp eyes, jotting down every detail. After nearly an hour of conversation, she paused, set her pen down, tilted her head slightly. "So, did you do all this to prove something?" Mark looked at her, then down at his own hands, still stained with black grease between the nails even after washing. "I didn't do it to prove anything to anyone," he said, slowly, firmly. "I just didn't want to be called the poor mechanic anymore, not even by myself." Silence hung in the air for a few seconds. No one said anything. Then the reporter nodded and wrote his words down exactly as he said them. Some answers don't need unpacking. They land with their own weight. Life for Mark didn't change dramatically after that, but it wasn't the same either. He met someone new, Elena, at a classic car event organized by the city. She didn't know he owned a garage chain. She didn't care. She didn't ask much about the past. She liked how he spoke little but always at the right time. She liked the way he used both hands for everything. And she liked that he made coffee every morning with an old machine instead of grabbing it from a shop. They didn't rush. They didn't paint grand futures. They just spent time, cleaning out a storage room, changing a tire together, taking a quiet weekend trip out of town. One afternoon, Elena said, "I don't need you to be anyone. I just need to know, if my car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, you're the first person I want to call." To Mark, that was all the confirmation he needed. He was on the right road. By the end of the year, Mark launched a small scholarship program. No big names, no flashy foundation. Just a few free trade apprenticeships each cycle, offered to underprivileged teens in the city. He personally taught some of the classes. No slide decks, no lecture notes, just real cars, real problems, and real skills. One kid asked him, "Why are you doing this?" Mark just shrugged. "Because when I was your age, I didn't know where the hell to start either." For him, that was how you answer the past. Not with resentment, not with drama, but by making sure no one else gets stuck in the same dark place you once did. Each night after locking up the garage, Mark walked home to his small apartment 2 blocks away. He and Elena didn't live together, but they ate dinner together most nights. No fancy table, just a warm plate of pasta and a cheap glass of wine in a corner kitchen. And for both of them, that was more than enough. One evening, Elena asked, "Do you ever regret it? Trusting someone too much?" Mark paused for a few seconds, then said, "No. If that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have known how strong I needed to be to keep from falling apart." On his work desk now sat a new photo, not the old wedding picture, but one of him standing beside his students after their first hands-on session. One of them, a kid named Jay, would eventually stay on as his lead apprentice. Mark never brought up the past, not out of denial, but because it just wasn't necessary anymore. The people who hurt him had walked out of his life, one way or another. He didn't get revenge through pain. He didn't write long posts, didn't name names, didn't chase apologies. He just kept going. So far forward, no one would ever dare underestimate him again. He used to be called just a poor mechanic. Not once, many times. From the mouth of his ex-wife, in the eyes of his former boss, and even in his own thoughts, on the hardest, loneliest days. But what made him different wasn't money, wasn't recognition, and definitely wasn't revenge. It was the way he chose to keep going, quietly, without needing validation, without needing anyone to come back and apologize. None of us are born with worth written into us, but each of us has the right to build that worth, through action, through kindness, and through showing up with quiet consistency. Some wounds don't need soothing, they just need to be outgrown. And sometimes, what earns someone respect isn't the pain they went through, but how they stood back up. Without noise, without looking back. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated just because you hadn't made it yet? Will you stay quiet and live well, or rise up and show what you're made of? Let us know what you think. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything to us.